about not being a piece of crap.
And I'm going to introduce you, and then I will spotlight you so that it kind of fills the
Okay,
screen and do your share.
awesome.
Um, yeah, and good morning. Yeah, here they come. Okay, so I'm just going to keep adding people. Good morning, everybody. For those who have not been to a Jewish Therapist Collective event in the past, my name is Helena Brook. I'm a licensed professional counselor in Arizona and the founder and director of the Jewish Therapist Collective. We have been doing advocacy and community building for the better part of a decade for Jewish psychotherapists, grad students, and related professionals, as well as the clients that we serve. And this year it's been really exciting because we've had some really exceptional webinars and presentations by clinicians in our community who are doing some really great leadership and research and just cool stuff. So if you would like access to the past recordings, reach out at connect@jewishtherapists.org, or you can go to jewishtherapists.org and click the join button to have access to those. But without further ado, I'm really, really excited to introduce Elizabeth Hlavek. Did I pronounce it correctly? Yeah?
Hlavek, the H is silent. Yeah. Mhm.
Okay. Elizabeth Hlavek, and she is an art therapist and also has done an incredible piece of documentation and research on art that was created during the Holocaust, and has written a book about it. Also has some really incredible insight and perspective for us. And so we thought, what an honor to be able to highlight her and celebrate her work today um, during Yom HaShoah, because of course, more than anything, I think we focus so much on what our people have been through, but more than anything, we are such a vibrant, tenacious, generative people, and I, for one, am really excited to learn today. So, without further ado, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. So what I'm going to do is kind of go through a PowerPoint, and I know we have, not we have an hour, and I want to make sure there's opportunities for questions or whatever, but I do have a lot of dense information. Um, so a little bit of background. I'm an art therapist. I live in Annapolis, Maryland. And right before I started my master's in art therapy, in 2006, I had an opportunity to go to Prague, where we visited the Terezin ghetto, as well as the Prague Jewish Museum. And growing up in a strong Jewish community in Baltimore, I've obviously always been very familiar with the Holocaust. Was um, knew it had happened, had met survivors, but I wasn't familiar with art that was created by victims. And while I was in the Terezin ghetto touring the memorial, as well as the Prague Jewish Museum, there was so much art on display that was created mostly clandestinely by victims in captivity. And I was about to start my art therapy master's program, and it just felt like there was this connection between art therapy, the idea of creating art to better one's circumstance, to better one's life, or to express oneself, and the fact that these people were making art, often out of like really like found materials, to improve their psyche in captivity. So I spent some time, looking into it, and I kind of continued with the idea of curiosity about art from the Holocaust. And then in 2015, I started a master's program. I started a doctoral program with the intent of researching this further. So for my research, I interviewed 5 surviving artists, so people who had created art either in a camp or a ghetto or in hiding during the Holocaust. Um, and then a few second generationers, so people who, for example, there was this one artist named Helena Olomuski, who I'm going to show a bit of her artwork. She passed away in 2007, so that was after I was doing this research, but I was really curious about her, so I was able to interview her daughter, and she gave me kind of a second generation nurse testimony about her mother's experience. So what I'm going to do is open this. How do I share my gosh,
So
you
there
like
should
we all
be
know.
Along the bottom, there should be a green rectangle with a black arrow.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yep.
Great.
Sure. Great. Okay. So I have this open. Can everyone see that?
Yeah, you're great.
Okay, you'd think by like 2025 we would be pros at this, but I rarely share my screen. So
And sometimes you do everything right, but it doesn't convey to the participants, so it's always good to ask.
thank you. Okay, so let us, whoop. Great. Okay. So I'm going to start this by just talking about the artwork, giving people some background, and then kind of grounding it into existential theory, which is what I did for my doctorate. And I'm not going to be looking at the chat, but I'm obviously, please put questions in there as they come up. So a couple of some background information to kind of help understand this body of work. So I typically describe Holocaust artwork. And when I say that, I'm referring to pieces of artwork that were created by victims in captivity, in ghettos, in camps, or in hiding. When I was doing this research, I wasn't really interested in artwork that was made afterwards, like in response. Certainly, there is an enormous connection between art therapy and trauma response, and responding to challenge um, to loss and adversity. But I was really focused on understanding how why people would create art, would choose to use art in the moment, in this ongoing experience. Um, so yes, the focus is really on artwork specifically from 1933 to 1945. However, I did include artwork and artists to interview who had created art both in camps as well as immediately after. I think it's important to remember that although, as each camp and ghetto was liberated, there was still so much uncertainty. And those times were almost even worse because people were finding out the horrors of everything that went on. And they were still in this really uncertain circumstance. They were basically just in these camps with no guards. So I included some pieces from this liberation period because again, they kind of fall into that area of creating artwork in the midst of, in the midst of a genocide. So over 40,000 works have been documented since liberation, although that's estimated to only represent about 10% of the total art that was created. So I think it's so important to think about that. Like the Holocaust is synonymous with destruction. We think of nothing being saved. The goal was complete annihilation of anyone who didn't fit the Nazi ideal. So the idea of 40,000 works just being saved, still existing, I think is really amazing. And obviously these works aren't, it's not like they're these full-scale oil paintings like the one behind me. We're talking about small, scraps of paper, pieces that had to be like reconstructed afterwards, but still they were all done with this creative impulse. Um, I would say most people who I talk about this with are familiar with the Theresian Ghetto, which was known for its artistic culture. But the artwork that I found has been documented from camps and ghettos across Europe. And so I think it's really interesting how thematically there's so many similar pieces, regardless of location. Um, in my book, I kind of break the artwork down into themes and content of the artwork. And it's really interesting that regardless of the, camp or ghetto or country that people were in, the content of the art as well as the drive to create it was all really similar. And then one little connection to art therapy. So Edith Kramer, who is a pioneer of American art therapy, actually immigrated to the United States in the 1930s with her family to avoid Nazi persecution. However, prior to that, she had worked closely with an artist, a Bauhaus-educated artist named Friedel Dicker Brandeis, who was sent to the Theresian Ghetto and actually made it her mission to work with the children there. So some people are familiar with the book, I Never Saw Another Butterfly, or just the children's art in the Theresian Ghetto, and that was all created under the guise of Friedel Dicker Brandeis. And she was sent to Auschwitz and perished. However, Edith Kramer, when she wrote her first book, Art as Therapy with Children, dedicated it to Friedel's memory. I think it's so important to remember that the significance of this artwork isn't just in the content, but also the process of creating it. In order to fully appreciate it and to fully contextualize it, we really have to understand some of the challenges that the artists faced. I think it's important to remember that the Holocaust was about dehumanization, in addition to starvation, in addition to abuse, and separation. Um, Dehumanization was a huge goal of the Nazis. And so any cultural activity, anything that was like humanizing, was typically not permitted. And artists often put themselves at great risks if they were caught. There's many examples of artists who were caught either creating artwork or with their artwork, and they were brutally tortured or even killed. One artist actually, who I'm going to share some of his work later, he drew portraits in Auschwitz, and he was caught. His images were all found, and he was sent to the penal unit for about 3 months, but then he returned to his barrack and continued making artwork. So stories like that, again, just make me wonder why create? What is the point? Like if every goal within your existence within a camp or within a ghetto is geared towards survival, why take the time to create artwork? Um, Obviously, there were a limited amount of materials to work with. Some individuals were able to access materials based on their jobs. So, for example, there was a group of artists in the Theresian ghetto who were assigned to work in the design department. They had to actually make a lot of propaganda for the ghetto, but as a result, they had art materials at their disposal. And so they would work with them when they could. Um, Other artists kind of found stuff. I read a story about an artist who was tasked with like cleaning, like laundering Nazis' uniforms and coats, and they would pluck feathers out of the coats in order to use as paintbrushes. So, there's numerous ways to kind of be creative with materials. One of the artists who survived, and I interviewed, he actually showed me in his studio how he would mix like soot and oil and just some sort of like pigments to create paint. Um, Obviously, keeping the artwork was difficult. People always ask me how the artwork was saved, how it was found. A lot of times individuals would just hide it, or in some cases destroy it after creating it. And then certainly just this like environment of destruction, um, and how one could even understand, a rationale, a goal, a desire to create artwork in such a bleak, hopeless environment. So, like I mentioned before, the artwork, I kind of other scholars have done this as well, but in my own position as an art therapist, I kind of divided the artwork into categories. And so portraiture comprised 25% of all documented artwork created during the Holocaust, both in ghettos, in camps, in hiding, and even afterwards. Um, which obviously, suggest a desire to like remember people, to affirm their existence, to show that they were here, that they were in this place and time. Certainly there was a desire to portray the realities of camp and ghetto life, like poor conditions and violence. And so there's a number of artworks that show that. Um, in addition to that, and this is something that I didn't add to this presentation, but one subcategory of that I've discovered is transit images. I think there's a number of images of individuals in transit, whether it's people showing people in their in the cattle cars or in these long lines, walking towards the ghetto or leaving the ghetto. But just the constant transitions and the being moved around without um, any sort of autonomy or knowledge of where one was going, I think was a huge part of the torture, of the psychological torture. And so I consider a subcategory to be just transitions. Um, Scenes of life before the war comprise a number of the artworks. Obviously, people were trying to retain their sense of identity and remember what their life was like before that. another category that I consider to be camp and ghetto landscapes. So people just either taking a moment to recognize the beauty of nature around them. There's this wonderful Viktor Frankl quote in Man's Search for Meaning where he talks about how, he and his fellow prisoners were, pulled out of their barracks at, an ungodly hour and were standing in the cold at roll call. But one of them looked up and they all looked up at the sky and there was just this like remarkable sunrise. And he commented, we remembered how beautiful life could be. So when I see some of these images of just like a sun, these paintings or drawings of a sun rising or, a forest or some flowers in the ghetto or camp, it reminds me of that quote and the idea that, these individuals were able to find beauty despite just the ugliness around them. I also suspect that camp landscapes helped with some survival instinct in order to like put a place and a time to help kind of center oneself and identify, specifically where they were. And it also led to it helped show that, these atrocities had happened and we can link them to a certain spot. Another category is depictions of interactions between victims. And I think this is so important because, again, the focus so much was on dehumanization. So many individuals were separated from their families, from their friends, obviously from their communities. I also think it's really important. I do want to pause here and remind people, and I'm sure this group is well aware, but I think it's important to share that, this didn't start with like Auschwitz. Hitler was elected in 1933, and Poland wasn't annexed until 1939. People didn't start going to Auschwitz until 1940, 1941. Need to double check that. But my point is that, in the years prior to that, there was instances of marginalization of Jews and other, others deemed undesirable, being taken out of their schools, being taken out of their works, being moved into certain areas, not being allowed to shop at certain stores. So again, especially, in our current times, I think it's so important to remember that the marginalization is what started everything. It was kind of the first step. But because of this, I think depictions of interactions between victims is so important because it shows that people were able to, um, retain some degree of humanity and connection with one another, and show a mutual concern and respect for others. And there's actually a number of works that are satirical. There's some comics, there's some, you know, uh, characters like of Hitler, doing ridiculous stuff. And I think it's wonderful to see that this, people invoked humor in their artwork, again, despite their location. Obviously, it goes without saying that there are some images that might be graphic and disturbing, but I think it's important to just, send a reminder there. So one of my questions when I was doing this research was like, why? What is the point? Like, why create this artwork in the first place? Oh, I'm sorry. And so I completed a phenomenological study so I interviewed individuals who had survived or second generationers of people who had created art in captivity. And so I found the following reasons, the following themes came up. So individuals created artwork as a means of resistance, to affirm their existence, to honor and remember, to document what had happened, to increase a sense of community as an outlet for expression, and to give themselves a sense of autonomy. And throughout this presentation, you'll see examples of all of those. This image on the left was created by Yehuda Bekan. I actually interviewed him in Jerusalem in 2017. He survived the Theresian Ghetto as well as Auschwitz. This drawing is an example of that kind of in between art where it was created immediately after liberation. It's titled "To the Person Who Restored My Faith in Humanity," and it's about him, being liberated in Auschwitz. Interestingly enough, his artwork was actually used in the Eichmann trials to convict Nazis of war crimes. Also, I apologize. I know that I tend to speak quickly. I know that I'm moving very fast. There's just so much that I want to share, and I want to be mindful of people's time. So, thinking about resistance, um, the idea of cultural resistance is like so often artwork from the Holocaust is thought of as cultural resistance, right? And Lawrence Langer, who is a Holocaust scholar, really argued that that doesn't seem right. Resistance suggests that there's like a chance. Resistance suggests that both sides are evenly matched. And that simply wasn't accurate. So he kind of frowns on the concept of cultural resistance because it wasn't necessarily a resistance to it's not like creating artwork was going to save people's lives. Joshua Sobel, who wrote and performed a play, Ghetto, in the Vilnius ghetto, I think he summed it up really well. He said that resistance towards the Germans mustn't only mean um, getting hold of weapons and fighting. The Germans aren't only waging a fight to the battle against our bodies, it's our soul thereafter. Our battle against them has to be spiritual. And I think this helps us kind of contextualize the motivation for creating art, or at least one of the motivations. This was about maintaining a sense of cultural appreciation, maintaining a sense of humanity, and choosing how one wants to live within the confines of their existence. So these are drawings created by Charlotte Borisova in the Terezin ghetto. So she was sent there from Bohemia and wanted to depict, the culture that she had been accustomed to prior to her deportation. She did these series of dancers. Um, and again, these don't look like you wouldn't expect this type of image to be coming from a Nazi ghetto, but she drew these from memory. At times she had people pose, who, if there was a dancer who was imprisoned with her. I love this image. I just adore this image. Um, and I think it was created by an unknown artist in Ravensbrück, which was the largest only female camp. On the back of it, it says, like, give me the strength to do the deed. Um, but I think this really highlights the resistance against dehumanization. Um, an art historian in England described the primary impulse was not to expose the full horrors of what was going on, but to restore some sense of humanity and dignity, even sometimes a semblance of normalcy to the most dehumanizing of environments. And that's kind of what Friedel Dicker Brandeis had done. She led art lessons for these kids. She wanted to give them a sense of normalcy, kind of just bring things back to a place that they remembered since everything was just so uncertain and so bizarre. One of the artists who I interviewed, um, she was on the Katzner transport to Bergen-Belsen from Hungary, and her mother had been a designer in Hungary. And so they got to Bergen-Belsen, and one morning her mother told all the kids in their barracks to pick up a stick and come meet her outside. And she just gave them art lessons, with having them draw with sticks in the dirt. Um, and, her goal was just to like brighten morale and to give them some sense of normalcy, pretend like we're going to school, pretend that um, there's some familiar structures at place. Um, this was a really interesting artist. His name was Alfred Cantor. And his artwork is so interesting. So he was one of the first prisoners sent to the Theresian ghetto. He had actually been in art school at the time. He was about 18, and he was sent to the Theresian ghetto and was actually tasked with kind of building it. Um, and he began to draw everything he saw every night. Like there was just he described these bizarre scenes that he just couldn't make sense of. So he started to draw them. But he was obviously afraid of getting caught with his drawings, and so he drew them and then immediately destroyed them. Um, he was sent to 4 additional camps after that and drew as often as he could, repeating his process of drawing and then shredding, the evidence. When he was finally liberated, someone gave him a journal, like blank notebook, at a displaced persons camp, and he spent the entire summer of 1945 recreating the drawings that he had done from memory to, again, just to put them in place to kind of, well, to document them, but to bring all his memories together. And then years later, he published it as the Book of Alfred Cantor. And the book pretty much looks like this. It's, a drawing on each page with kind of a like crude description underneath. So I found in my research that preserving a sense of identity was such a significant part of the motivation. One artist who I was particularly drawn to was Helena Olamuski, who, like I said, passed away, I believe, from Alzheimer's in 2007. I was able to meet with her daughter in Ashkelon, and she said, you know, drawing art, it was such a big part of her identity that if she didn't draw, she would lose herself. It wasn't a part of her, it was her. Um, and we hear about the concept of Musulman, right? The idea of like losing all sense of self and all sense of motivation. And I think for some of these artists, drawing, even with any materials they could find, um, just preserved their sense of identity, preserved who they were um, prior to their captivity. The image on the right is of a man who had just had his beard shaved in the Warsaw Ghetto. And you can see in both of these, like it's pretty minimal materials. Kind of she used what she could access. What's interesting is that she did so many drawings. She hid them in concrete and then came back after the war to find them in Birkenau. Um, she continued creating artwork throughout her life, and her style remains consistent, which again really highlights how creating artwork was just her identity, and she was able to claim her identity through that. Here are 2 more of her drawings. And again, I think you can see how frail these are, right? Like the image on the left is done on this like small sheet of paper. This is housed at the Ghetto Fighters Museum in northern Israel. They have really maintained a lot of artwork and preserved it since so much of it is so frail. Um, So Samuel Back was an artist in the Vilnius ghetto. He was 9 years old when his family was taken there. And I actually had the opportunity to FaceTime with him last week. He lives in Boston. He's 91. I had interviewed him in 2017 via Skype, like before, we relied on Zoom. Um, and we talked about the artwork that he had done as a 9-year-old child in the Vilnius ghetto. He liked art, he enjoyed it. And Vilnius, I guess, was considered like they called it like Little Jerusalem. It was quite the cultural center of Lithuania. And so the ghetto maintained that. The individuals who were sent to the Vilnius ghetto um, kept that, cultural vibrance alive as best they could. So there were shows, there were exhibits, and excuse me, at age 9, he was invited to participate in this art exhibit. Um, and so when, I interviewed him, he said, I did drawings and painted and so on. This was part of breathing. This just like became who he was. he's continued to create artwork since. A lot of it has themes of the Holocaust and his memories. He's represented by the Pucker Gallery, which is in Boston on Newbury Street. A lot of his artwork is there. And I had been put in touch with the gallery and was invited to tour it. So I went up last week. I was supposed to go to Sam's studio and get to meet with him and see some of his latest projects, but he wasn't feeling well and he's 91, so I wasn't going to press the issue. But he's currently working on a batch of paintings for a show to open this October, um, which I'm hoping to be able to go to. So many artists created an attempt to honor and remember people. Um, these were all created by Franz Joswecki, who was the artist I mentioned in Auschwitz, who did about, gosh, 110, 112, something like that, drawings of everyone around him. What's amazing about these is how lifelike they are. They are just so realistic. Um, the um, the Auschwitz Museum, their Twitter account and now their Blue Sky account, actually posts an image, like their inmate photos when they're processed. They post those daily. Um, and in some instances, they actually post, since they have all these original drawings, they posted the person next to the drawing that Franz Joswecki did. And the likeness is incredible. So I mean, he really was so talented, and he really did preserve um, these people's identities and their existence. He was caught, his drawings were all found, and he was sent to Block 11, which was the penal unit. He was released and then continued to draw because it was so important to him. Um, he was later sent to Buchenwald, and he did survive, but died soon after. Um, So Helena Olomoski was obviously interviewed a number of times as a survivor, and so I read multiple testimonies by her as well as watched like video footage, to kind of cross-reference against the information that her daughter gave me. And I thought this quote was so interesting. She said, "While I was in Birkenau, someone told me if you live to leave this hell," um, sorry, my the tab is blacked. "Make your drawings and tell the world about us. We want to remain among the living, at least on paper." So her goal in drawing was to preserve these people's memories, to show that they weren't just, that they didn't just disappear, that they had existed, that they had been around. Um, and she described that as like a force that kind of carried her to survival. She just felt like she had to. She couldn't perish because she had a job to do. She had to continue to draw these people around her and show them to the world. And again, you can see how frail this image is, just the paper, and how some of them, when you see them in person, you can see the multiple folds and how artwork was just folded over and over again and stored. Once again, to honor and to remember individuals, that was a goal. Yehuda Bekan, whose drawings were used in the Eichmann trials, when I met with him, he talked about how, he spent his whole teenage years in captivity, and he felt like, I don't have an education. What can I do? He was so lucky to have survived. He literally, it was an issue of him stepping in one line as opposed to another, and he was able to avoid the gas chambers. Um, and he talked about, seeing friends of his, seeing people he knew marching to the gas chambers. And yet he felt so responsible. And he said, "I thought, what can I do? I must be the spokesperson for the children's souls that don't exist anymore." So he found that creating artwork, showing what had happened, was a way to give them a voice. These were portraits created by an artist in Auschwitz, Zofia Bestor-Sepien. And again, I think these are just so soft. You know, you wouldn't think that these women were prisoners, were captives. She really aimed to show them for who they were, for who, you know, these like soft, innocent creatures. This one you can see quite well how the paper on the portrait was like folded over and over as if it, you know, had to be hidden multiple times, folded, refolded, stored. I just think these are so delicate looking. It's, you know, you wouldn't think that they were created in the space that they came from. Oh, I'm sorry. So again, to document, this was created by an artist, Alexander Bogan, who was in the Vilnius ghetto, although he escaped twice and joined the Partisans, which were a group of resistance fighters who basically took it upon themselves to find Nazis and kill them. He joined a group of Russian partisans, and he would draw. He drew in the ghetto, and then he would draw while they were, you know, around the campfire at night. I did not get a chance to interview him. However, he talked about this particular drawing, how he saw this young girl in the ghetto and she was all alone. He assumed that her parents were killed and that she, you know, wouldn't fare long. Um, and he thought, what can I do? Like he described feeling so helpless, being like, I'm this big man, I'm an adult, I'm strong, and yet there's nothing in my power I can do to help this girl. Um, And so he thought, well, I can preserve her. You know, again, I can preserve the memory of her. And he described himself as an artist doomed to death, preserving those also doomed to death. Um, I think about this, you know, when Viktor Frankl wrote about, you know, values or pathways towards finding meaning and how individuals, you know, can find meaning via creative pursuits, via experiential pursuits, or in their attitude. So how one chooses to respond in a challenging situation. And I think Alexander Bogan, I think all of the artists certainly demonstrate this, but Alexander Bogan, you know, his response in saying, what can I do? I guess I'll draw her. I guess I'll do what I can. I can't save her, but what I can preserve her. There's actually, I have a colleague, an art therapy colleague who I believe lives in Germany. But one time I was speaking about this at a conference, and she shared that her grandfather was a partisan with Alexander Bogan. And she had like heard stories about him. So we actually looked through some of his drawings to see if we could find one that resembled her grandfather. But you know, he wasn't really focused on likeness. It was more about the figures. Um, so obviously documentation was a huge part of an artist's goal. You know, the Nazis really tried to cover up a lot of their crimes. People are familiar with how Theresian was used as a like facade, a model ghetto. Um, Individuals who I interviewed who were held captive at Theresian talked about how when the Red Cross came to visit, they had to put on this front, you know, and pretend that everything was fine when clearly it wasn't. And so this one artist, I think it's really interesting. You know, some artists had said that the goal was to honor, to remember. But he said, I want these to be a document. I want them to be considered a living and shocking document of a world of horror and torment. I want the young to know how it was so that they understand and will not allow such conditions to ever be repeated in the future. He didn't do this drawing, it was from Ravensbrück, by an unknown artist. But again, I think it's so interesting how you see this helpless woman, you know, being beaten and these people just looking on and not doing anything about it. Um, Aside from just you know, the violence, we also see just this like passiveness and indifference. Um, and this image I just think really relates to the idea that like we need to understand how the horrors and torment that occurred, and to avoid repeating them. And more documentation. The image on the left, the artist titled Friendly Favor, these men kind of helping a comrade who had not been able to walk himself from roll call. And the image on the right was created by Leo Haas, who was one of the artists in the Theresian ghetto. He was part of what's known as the Theresian Artist Affair, where there were these 4 artists who were quite talented and had relative comfort in that they were, stationed in the design department. They were tasked with creating Nazi propaganda, and they were able to have relative comfort. They weren't doing manual labor, they were indoors. They had each other, they were actually doing something that they were skilled at, but there was this dissonance in knowing that they were creating something for their perpetrators, and to like, you know, keep this lie going. And so when their official duties were over, they would stay in the studio and draw what was actually going on, some of the hangings, the beatings, the poor conditions. Um, they were eventually caught, and each of them was, they were detained in the small fortress, which was the concentration camp part of the ghetto. And some with their families, some were tortured. Um, Few survived. I think only one artist ended up surviving, but he actually went on to adopt the son of another artist. And I think that really shows just how connected these artists felt, how creating artwork together provided such a sense of community, which they were lacking. More documentation. The one on the left, I always like to share artwork by Jacques Gatko in the Compiègne camp, which was a French internment camp. Internment camps were kind of interesting because they were basically this like holding spot. The conditions were quite poor, but they weren't, death camps or labor camps. They were really just kind of holding spaces. Um, and in some instances, the Red Cross was able to get materials, food, as well as art supplies for some reason to them. But a number of them, had packed up all their belongings, and so they had brought materials. So there was actually quite a cultural community within the Gurs camp, which is by the Pyrenees Mountains. But Gatko did a number of prints that look like this. He actually found a tire. Um, and so he started like figuring out what he could dip it in and making these like lina cuts, which is so interesting. Um, so not only was he documenting what was going on, this bleakness of the camp, or but also kind of preserving his own style in doing that. The image on the right was created by Karl Fleischmann, who is actually a physician. So he was sent to the infirmary in the Theresian ghetto, but he was quite a talented artist, as you can see. And so occasionally he would join the design department and draw what he, had experienced. There's a number of artworks that show the sense of community that individuals found through cultural activity. Um, in some of the ghettos, individuals were able to maintain like a cultural vibrance. So there were musicians who were able to play. They made plays. They made, like I said before, there were art exhibits. So this young woman, Helga Weissova, she was separated from her father in Terezin, and before leaving, he told her, draw what you see. And so she made that her mission to draw everything that she saw. And this is one of the images. She saw people kind of coming together for enjoyment. And again, I just think the dignity, that it takes to put on this show, to say we're gonna watch a show and we're gonna enjoy it. We're not animals. We're not nothing. We have an appreciation for beauty. And this is one of my favorite images. It was created by Lily Andrew, who survived the war. She drew this in Gurs, and I just think it's so tender. We associate the Holocaust with these harsh moments. And so I think it's important to remember that, the victims were also people capable of love, capable of gentleness and tenderness, and to see just how, how these relationships and this connection was severed. And these are some images of individuals in, I believe they're both from the Theresian ghetto, of individuals engaging in cultural activity. So praying, having services. You can see Talit in the image on the left, and then again having concerts, having cultural activity. So building a community and wanting to depict that community, showing that again we are able to maintain this. So this is a really wonderful story. Samuel Beck, who was 9, um, for a brief moment, he was hiding with his family in a church, and he had this postcard of Moses carrying the Ten Commandments. And his dad came back from, doing his labor, and he was able to bring him some clay. And Samuel Beck said to himself, I want to make a statue of Moses, kind of like the Golem in Prague. He thought, Moses is the great liberator of enslaved and oppressed Jews. And therefore, I thought it would be very auspicious at age 9 to create a sculpture for the ghetto in his honor. So he wanted to create this symbol to like bring the community together and give them a sense of hope. He was 9. He had a very little amount of clay, and the sculpture didn't come out as he anticipated. But this is a sketch, before the sculpture, which did remain. And I just love the idea that this 9-year-old felt a desire to contribute to his community. We have an outlet for expression. Certainly, there was a lot of intense emotion that people weren't allowed to share. And so I think just looking at these images, we're able to see the pain and the horror that people felt and experienced. And not our role, our goal isn't, there's nothing we can do about it other than honor it, honor its existence. There's 2 additional ones. And ultimately, autonomy. I think creating artwork gave individuals a sense of purpose and gave them, a sense of control over their environment. This was created by Charlotte Salmon, who was in hiding in France. She created this whole series called Life or Theater while she was in hiding. She was eventually found and taken to Auschwitz and murdered. But she has these like gouache images, and she's basically rewriting her story of how her family fled. Um, and rewriting, what happened to give her, a sense of control over it and not let herself be this like helpless victim. Frederick Terna, who lived to be, I want to say he lived to be 99 years old. He passed away in Brooklyn a few years ago, but I interviewed him, and he said, if one's life is in a straitjacket of a concentration camp with all the restrictions, well, a white sheet of paper and a drawing tool, there I am in control. That gave me autonomy. We talked about how, he had no control over anything, but when he looked at a blank piece of paper, he could do whatever he wanted. And it was so inspiring to him. And so creating artwork, again, led to this sense of purpose, this sense of autonomy, this sense of doing something that felt authentic. He did become a professional artist. He thought to himself, what he actually had never created artwork prior to his captivity, and he thought to himself in Teresian, if I survive this, perhaps I will go on to be an artist, which he did. And he had a studio in Brooklyn, and he lived to be 99. These were these tiny sculptures created out of like wooden planks. You can see on the left, it's like a 2x4. These were these tiny sculptures that this French priest who was captured made. Clay just has, or not clay, 3-dimensional materials just have this kind of already evoke a sense of autonomy, in that you're like creating something in sculpting. And I think these just show, his desire to bring life to anything, to, create something out of nothing, something, that he had to work with. And finally, this image I think is so beautiful. And you can see just like the sunrise or the sunset, like kind of the beauty in the sky, and seeing that there's still some kindness in the world. Okay, so I after, doing all this research, I linked it to the concept of finding meaning, right? Ultimately, it seemed, based on everything I had read about existential theory and meaning, um, it seemed that the motivation for creating all this artwork was a search for meaning. Um, so obviously that took me to Viktor Frankl and his own work. He created logotherapy, which literally translates to meaning therapy. He was an Austrian psychotherapist who, prior to the start of World War II, had felt that psychology and medicine had become overly clinical, and he really wanted to focus on people's like he wanted to bolster people's spirit in order to support their health. He was sent to Raisin and set up a psychohygiene clinic, and then sent to Auschwitz, where he wrote Man's Search for Meaning, or he that motivated Man's Search for Meaning. He'd actually had a book he later published called The Doctor and the Soul, which the manuscript had been with him into Raisin and then was taken from him at Auschwitz. He was sent to two Dachau subcamps and eventually created the concept of logotherapy. So his experience in the Holocaust only affirmed his conviction that meaning is critical to existence. He stated that life has meaning under all circumstances, even the most miserable. The primary motivation for living is a will to find meaning in life, and that we as individuals have freedom to find meaning in what we do, and what we experience, as well as the stand we take when faced with a situation of unchangeable suffering. And so I think about this, in regards to the artist who created. Obviously, making art wasn't going to save them. Obviously, it wasn't going to bring them more rations of food, or have guards be kinder to them or end the war in any way. But it was a way for them to find meaning in their circumstance. It was a way for them to find a reason to keep going every day. Meaninglessness is found in the absence of purpose or cohesion or explanation. And so creating artwork gave people a sense of purpose. One artist in Auschwitz had commented that he was in the infirmary and someone got him a pencil, and he said, "Life once again acquires meaning and purpose." And Helena Olamuski had said that drawing portraits of her fellow captives was a force that carried her to survival. Her purpose in life was to live so that she could testify of what happened. And Frankl argued that life is never made unbearable by circumstance, only by lack of meaning and purpose. And so I really believe that creating artwork led to a sense of meaning, whether it was with the goal to remember people, whether it was the goal to document what had happened, their goal to preserve some sort of identity, but ultimately, meaning was the crux of why people created artwork. I think that art allowed for a sense of meaning and purpose, which, like I said before, challenged the Musulman status. Musulman being a prisoner who's lost all will to live and pretty much resigned himself to death. Creating artwork helped people, give people a meaning so that they avoided that. So a few concluding thoughts. I think this artwork forces us to look at the individual within a mass genocide. So often we're presented with the atrocities of the Holocaust, and it's too much for one to comprehend. And we become desensitized to it because it's just so massive. I think when we look at the artwork, we're able to see individuals and recognize under individual stories. It certainly demonstrates the human capacity for resilience. It provides authentic evidence of the Holocaust experience. So as survivors pass on, This is great testimony. Additionally, I say authentic evidence because it was created in the moment. You know, survivor testimony is incredibly valuable, but it can at times be distorted by just the function of time and memory. And this artwork actually was done in the moment while there. So there's this like authenticity to it that doesn't exist in you know, later testimonies. Um, it highlights the importance of dignity and humanity, and again suggests that the artistic engagement contributed to psychic survival. Um, Here's my contact information. Um, and this, just to give you a sense of how the artwork, how much artwork there is, and the size. This is a storage room at the collections department in at the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. So you can just see the many, many drawings and paintings that they have, and that's only one institution that houses them. So I'm going to open this back up. I'll leave this up, but I would love to chat again. I know we're very close to time, but I see that there's some in the some words in the chat, and I'd love to open it up to you know, anyone who has any questions or conversate, you know, wants to have a quick conversation.
There we go. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was absolutely incredible. And
Oh, thank you.
yeah, I was watching some of that chat too, and just knowing the people who are here. I don't recognize everybody, but we have some folks who are art therapists and some folks who use their generativity in some really, really cool ways, like leading support groups for populations within our population. Moran is here and is going to be doing like an art and drama experience at our retreat. So I think this was a very personal, personally tethered presentation for a lot of folks. And I just really appreciate you being here. So if anybody wants to, like, please ask Elizabeth questions. If any piece of art or wisdom that was shared today was particularly striking to you, feel free to share. I know for me, like the one piece with the eyes, it was I put it in the chat, but
Bedrick Frida's.
yeah,
Yeah.
chills. I think it really hit me. Was there a story behind that, or was it sort of?
Um, no, he was one of the artists in the design department, and he actually it was his child who was adopted. Who so he Bedrick Frida was a wonderful artist. What's interesting about that is that he had actually made this book for his son Tommy into Raisin about, you know, what how for his birthday, and it was about how a 3-year-old should be celebrating his birthday. Um, and so I think it's interesting how the book is so like lighthearted, and then that image you pointed out, like it's so intense. Um, so yeah, it just, you know, highlights like what he wants and what he is exposed to.
Yeah, wow. You were also talking about resistance, and it's so interesting because the duality that I picked up on was whenever you're creating something, whether it's, you know, whether it's in a piece of like temporary media or something that was more steadfast, like these, it kind of it pushes in the opposite direction of erasure. It's expansiveness through time
Yes.
and visually too, and it's a really striking example of
Yeah, I think ultimately, again, like the idea of resistance, it's resistance against erasure. Like again, showing that because the goal wasn't just, you know, torture and death, but it was annihilation.
yeah,
And so, you know, having just documents was a sense of resistance.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I mean the feedback in here, thank you for your scholarship. It was really
Thank you.
interesting. Um, yeah, you can come off the mute too if you'd like to, Mary. When you described so powerful and bone chilling, especially given the state of the world today.
It
Yeah,
is, it's so difficult to, and just some of the images we've seen that, you know, coming out of like El Salvador, and just the how similar they are. It's really, it is chilling, and it's like how I don't understand how we can forget, you know.
yeah,
And as Jews, you know, obviously, I don't want to get into a whole political discussion, and I know that there's you know, communities within the larger Jewish community that support the administration, those who don't. But as Jews, I think, you know, knowing what humankind is capable of, and knowing that like what marginalization and othering can do, you know, and the path that that leads down. I mean, I think that we should all be appalled by
Yeah.
the rhetoric.
Yeah. Well, just yesterday, one of the themes, because we all have those themes that come into our clinical space. I work with a lot of neurodivergent folks, and so the recent theme that we've been dealing with is that move by RFK to essentially put all of our autistics on a register,
Yeah,
and it's jarring. I mean, autistic adults and children don't deserve that, you know.
no.
So
Well, and it kind of reminds me of oh my gosh, I can't think of it, but the was it the Nuremberg Law? The no, the where how like the Nazis kind of said like, well, this person, if you have this blood and you have this blood, then you means this, and they were like making lists of
yeah, yeah,
who was German and who wasn't, and it's just yeah,
yeah,
it's like a
yeah,
registry of people's differences.
yeah,
Yeah. So, yeah, as you're speaking, Elizabeth, and talking about what happened and then how they use their art to create to stay sane, to stay grounded, to stay something. And I'm thinking, this is happening again. Like
Yeah,
as I'm growing up, I'm thinking, how could that have happened? How could at least it won't? And now look at the world again.
yeah.
So I'm really happy to be part of this, so that I am an art therapist, and
Are
so
you?
yes, I
Where are
am.
you located?
I'm in Edmonton, Alberta.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah, and so with any of my clients, I work with mostly children and teens, and the trauma. A lot of them experience complex trauma, and so it just reminds me to get them to do their art, to help them, if nothing else, just to stay grounded from day to
Yeah.
day, just to get through the day and find some joy or
I
connect.
I think I think so often, like I imagine it's similar in Canada, but there's art therapists who feel so insecure in like what we do, or you know what we're, or we feel this need to like pathologize or clinify artwork. And certainly there's a place for that, but I think ultimately it's important to remember that like sometimes just the creating the artwork is what is therapeutic and what is grounding and what is just
Absolutely.
yeah.
When I was doing my capstone, I was reading about um, what are the anthropologist saying that it was our ability to create was one of the factors that advanced humans, that
Yeah.
allowed human beings to evolve. And
Hmm.
so I hear what you're saying, and yeah, we're psychotherapists, we're art therapists, we're not psychologists with PhDs, so therefore we need to stay. No, we're talking about the very thing that helps us evolve. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think also like artwork, I always say this when I'm presenting, you know, artwork has been used as a form of expression and communication for eons, you know, and we look at like
always has been.
you know, even like protest artwork or you know, like Picasso's Guernica, which is his like, you know, reconciliation of the Spanish Civil War. Like it's not the idea of creating artwork in response to tragedy isn't new. And it feels good and it helps people just kind of move forward with this, you know, really troubling, unsettling. It's a way to kind of just like reconcile these the challenges of existence.
Yeah. I like what you said about the woman who took the children out and would draw in nature and draw on the
Yes.
ground to give them some sort of normacy. And I think, well, actually that's what I've been doing recently, is going out to my garden and just getting my hands in the soil, because that's one thing politicians cannot take away from me.
I like that. I really like that.
I got a DM, and I'm gonna just kind of try to distill it down to a question. So,
Mhm.
we had this beautiful experience about kind of learning about a piece of our legacy as Jews and our resiliency and generativity in the camps. And someone had said they personally feel themselves shut down when discourses around the Shoah and sort of where where our people kind of coped and how we coped and what we did are sort of extrapolated to other populations' experiences, some of which overlap with the Jewish community and some of which don't. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about maybe the dialectic and sort of what we sit with both kind of holding sacred, like this is like about Jews, but then also like the piece about, well, how do we extrapolate this in our current context and how to sort of hold reverence for the sensitivity there. I don't know if that made sense.
No, it does. It does. I was teaching a class, like a workshop, and this woman asked me, like how if I ever like think about this in connection to slavery and like the Black American experience. And I was like, truthfully, I don't, because I don't, that's not my community. You know, I think that this is twofold. Like it's deeply personal. Just, being a Jewish woman. I mean, I didn't have any, all of my relatives had come to the United States well before this, but obviously there's this in this connection, no matter just because of the cultural implications. But it's also like there's just this overarching theme of like humanity, and like the cruelty that humans can put on each other. And so I think, evoking that, like making comparisons to the Shoah is it's not something that should be done loosely. I don't think it's something, and I think people often, for example, like when people, argue, say like there's a genocide happening in Gaza, and obviously that's like a terrible situation. But I think people often, use words inappropriately, to make a point. And I think sometimes there's a bit of hyperbole. I think connecting it, one thing that really stands out about the Shoah in particular is that, yes, the majority of people targeted were Jews, but it wasn't just Jews. It began people who resisted in any way were then imprisoned. People who, were gay or had, professions that, were deemed, uncouth. Like, so what's, and I think about this too, like what's challenging to wrap my head around is that like the Jewish experience, it was like it's happened over and over and over. This isn't, we tell the story of Passover, and then we look at like the pogroms and why my family left Eastern Europe and Russia in the early 1900s. So I think this was almost like I don't want to say culmination, because it's certainly still happening, but it was like this has happened over and over and over, and this was the most evil. But I think it's an important lesson of like what, and I think it's fair to find parallels and say like, wait, this happened, and like this, if this happened to us, it could happen to other people.
Yeah.
So I would say, I think that like you just have to kind of face it with a dichotomy, like recognize that there is this uniquely cultural significance, bless you, but also recognize that like this highlights what humans are capable of doing to other humans, and how any instances of marginalization can have devastating impacts.
Yeah.
I hope that answer, it's not,
Really well put.
thanks.
Yeah, really, really well put. I know that like for me, the line is kind of gratuitous thoughtless use and inversion, like Holocaust
Okay.
inversion, right? But aside from that, I think, for me thematically, I think like if we can draw insight and use the insight and the growth from our community to further tikkun olam in ways that
Yeah,
like rob our dignity, like 100%, that's important. So
right. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, again, like when, in the first Trump term, like people were making comparisons, and it was interesting because I was on a research trip in Berlin and I saw like the Berlin Wall, the remnants of the Berlin Wall. We went to Checkpoint Charlie and everything, and it was like, how is he campaigning on a wall?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
do people not remember how devastating a wall is? So again, it's like you need to like share this because people so easily forget. And again, how like one, it's like, oh, well, I don't want you shopping at my store. I don't want you going to my school within a decade that turned into mass execution.
Yeah.
So it can, I don't know. I just think that like evilness and this like this gosh, this need for power and this need for like to be right within human nature, for some people it can go from like from 0 to 100 basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, well, this was really, really exceptional. And
Thank you so much.
I posted the link to your book in the chat. I'm going to post it again because I think some folks got here a little bit late. But if you could just tell us the title, just in case people, I know a lot of people are like their preference is not to go through Amazon. It was just the
Yes.
easiest place that I found. So what is the title of your book? What does it look like, and how do we find it?
Sure. It's called A Meaning-Based Approach to Art Therapy. Do I have a copy in my office? I don't. That's okay. I mean, my name is pretty unique, so if you just look up Hlavek, art therapy, you'd probably find it. But it's organized into 3 sections. So the first is it's basically like theory, research, and practice. So the first is just basically understanding the concept of Holocaust artwork, just really going into the artist, how it was created, why it was created, categories of artwork, and then overlaps within the field of art therapy. And then the second section is a bit unconventional because it's really about like my research journey, how I got interested in this, how I, came across artwork and sought to find it. And then I share all the stories of the individuals who I interviewed, just, a little bit about their experience. One thing that's, sorry, I'm gonna pause. One thing that's really important to me in this research is that, so often people, survivors, are asked about like the most terrifying part of their life, when they're asked, like, people want to hear like, how thin were you and how many people did you lose and what did you overhear? And I noticed, when I interviewed them, they were all people who were quite comfortable being interviewed, who had been interviewed a number of times, but they were used to having to like recall the worst details of like their life. And I think they were almost caught off guard when I was asking them about their artwork because it was like, no, I don't want to, I know that. Like, I know, I know you were dying. I know you lost everything. I want to hear about how you survived, or how you tried to survive in this. Tell me about like I don't hear about the dehumanization. I want to hear about the part of you that remained human. And so I think, again, we tend to like fetishize or like look, overly, yeah, it's the same thing how we treat like serial killers and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And so it was really important for me to make sure that we had like information on the artists and their work and what happened to them afterwards. And then I talk about my, how I did a phenomenological study. And then the third part is kind of grounding this into existential theory and logotherapy, and then how this informs my clinical work.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that. And like as therapists, I mean, I think most of us love a good story, like the story of
Yeah,
people's lives, right?
yeah.
And we did my mentor she's not Jewish, she's Chinese American, but we did a presentation for ACA a couple years ago about like the career arcs of various Jewish thought leaders in the therapy world. And there's so much stuff that, you know, when we actually know about the lives of the people who produced the thing, or the lives beyond just the worst day of their lives, or what, kind of adding that depth and that full humanness, I think that's that dignity that Viktor Frankl always spoke of, was just like
Mhm.
the person, right? And it's I'm really glad that you shared that part in your book, because the research on its own is wonderful, but the research tethered to the person who did the research makes it like real. So,
Yeah. And I mean, I continue to be, I'm in touch with some of the artists who are still alive, or who, like Helena Lemoski's daughter and I are in touch. There's another woman who's, I was in touch with her, kind of through her father. And she and I are occasionally in touch, and, was hoping to see Samuel back last week. So I try to like, again, not just like utilize them for their stories, but kind of maintain some degree of connection and appreciation.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for everything. I'm gonna turn off the recording for now.
Okay.
So